Before diving into this incredible story, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every story has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. The reception hall was ablaze with light. Sparkling garlands, impeccably arranged white flowers, and an orchestra playing a gentle melody accompanied what was supposed to be the happiest day of Elizabeth's life. Yet, instead of seeing eyes filled with love, she felt an icy chill run down her spine. The groom, Brandon, stood before her, his smirk betraying an insolent arrogance. In a loud, mocking voice, he said, "Really, who would have thought you could wear that dress without looking like, well, we all know you weren't cut out for this sort of thing." The guests held their breath, some whispering amongst themselves, others frozen in a palpable unease. Elizabeth felt her cheeks burn, not with happiness, but with humiliation. She had always believed this wedding would be a dream come true, but now, in front of everyone, that dream was crumbling. What she didn't know was that an unexpected witness was silently approaching from behind Brandon. A man whose appearance would change the course of the evening and turn everything upside down. Brandon, lost in his own contempt, was too absorbed in his own arrogance to notice the shadow creeping up behind him. A shiver ran down Elizabeth's spine. She didn't yet know that this moment of humiliation would trigger a chain of events that neither she, nor Brandon, nor even their guests could have imagined. Brandon was still leaning over Elizabeth, a cruel smile on his lips, relishing every second of her humiliation. The murmurs of the guests grew to a heavy hum, but he seemed deaf to it all. Suddenly, a sharp noise rang out behind him, the clinking of a gold watch on the floor of the room. Brandon froze, but thinking it was nothing important, he barely turned around. And that's where he saw him. A tall, imposing man, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, walked slowly down the center aisle. His piercing blue eyes fixed on Brandon with an almost icy intensity. The man had an aura of quiet power, but enough to send a shiver of apprehension down everyone's spine in the room. "Brandon Hunter," he said in a calm but authoritative voice. "I think you've forgotten who you have in front of you tonight." Brandon burst into nervous laughter, thinking it was a bad joke. "And who are you? A friend of the bride?" The man took a step forward, and the murmur in the room grew even louder. "No. I'm the one who has the power to change this evening forever. And believe me, you don't want to find out how." Elizabeth looked up at him, stunned. There was something in his gaze, a mixture of determination and justice, that suddenly made her feel that everything could change in an instant. For the first time since the ceremony began, Brandon felt his arrogance waver. And while he was still trying to understand who this intruder was, Elizabeth realized that tonight, she might no longer be alone in facing her humiliation. The imposing man stopped right behind Brandon. Each step he took seemed to echo throughout the room, like a silent warning. The guests held their breath, some moving slightly closer to see what would happen next. "Brandon Hunter," the man repeated, this time in a firmer tone. "You dare to humiliate the woman you promised to love for life, without even knowing who's standing behind you." Brandon stiffened. He turned completely around and saw the man right in front of him. He had seen that face somewhere before, but couldn't remember. Who are you?" he stammered, his voice betraying the fear that was beginning to rise. The man smiled slightly, but it was anything but warm. "I'm Michael Davenport, lawyer and business partner of your future wife, and her adopted brother." A murmur rippled through the room. The guests exchanged surprised and intrigued glances. Brandon felt his heart sink. He had just realized that the woman he thought he dominated had someone powerful protecting her, and that someone wasn't at all impressed by his arrogance. Michael took another step forward, placing a firm hand on Brandon's shoulder. "Tonight you'll learn that actions have consequences, and that the humiliation you're inflicting on Elizabeth will come back to haunt you." Elizabeth felt a mixture of emotions, fear, surprise, but above all, a strange sense of security. For the first time since the beginning of the ceremony, she was no longer alone. She met Michael's gaze, and a faint smile appeared on her lips. Brandon, for his part, turned pale. He realized that he had underestimated this family, and that his night of glory had just turned into an imminent nightmare. Michael positioned himself right next to Elizabeth, his imposing presence creating a protective space around her. Brandon, still in shock, stammered a few words. "What are you going to do?" Michael inclined his head slightly, his piercing gaze fixed on him. "Tonight, I'm simply going to set things straight," he said calmly, but each word vibrated with an authority that Brandon could not ignore. Without warning, Michael took out his phone and made a few quick calls. The guests watched, intrigued, not understanding what was happening. A few minutes later, familiar faces from the worlds of business and high society entered the room, drawn by a simple message from Michael. "Brandon," Michael continued, his voice firmer this time, "everything you think you control disappears in an instant. Your arrogance will not have the last word." Brandon suddenly felt small, almost ridiculous, in front of all these unexpected witnesses. The murmurs in the room turned into admiring whispers from Michael and judgmental glances at him. Even some guests, who had previously respected him, began to avert their eyes. Elizabeth felt her heart beat faster. For the first time, she truly felt seen and protected. She noticed the relief on her face and, in an almost inaudible whisper, murmured, "Thank you." Michael responded with a look, as if to say, "This is only the beginning." Brandon, for his part, began to understand that his arrogance and contempt would not be enough to maintain control. He had just realized that the bride he thought was humiliated had an ally who would tolerate no injustice. And as the evening continued, Brandon felt the situation shift. The entire room now seemed to revolve around Michael and Elizabeth, and not him. Brandon, red with anger and humiliation, forced himself to stand up straight. He tried to regain his composure in front of the guests, but his eyes betrayed his fear. "Michael, you don't know who you're talking to," he snapped, his voice trembling despite himself. Michael, calm and unflappable, crossed his arms and took a step forward. "Oh, I know very well who I'm talking to. A man who thinks he can crush others to feel powerful." He paused, letting his words hang heavily in the air. "But tonight, you're going to learn what it feels like to be powerless in the face of the truth." Brandon stiffened, but pride compelled him to reply. "And what are you going to do? Ridicule me in front of all these people?" Michael gave a cold smile. "Exactly, but not with words." At that moment, Elizabeth, timidly but with newfound strength, stepped forward to stand beside him. "Brandon, look at yourself," she said in a clear voice that carried throughout the room. "You thought you could put me down, but you're the one who's small. And I refuse to remain silent in the face of your arrogance." The guests, surprised by her outburst, began to murmur, some quietly applauding Elizabeth's courage. Brandon faltered, unable to find a reply. He had underestimated his future wife's strength and Michael's presence, but above all, he hadn't anticipated that Elizabeth would dare to stand up for herself. Michael placed a hand on Elizabeth's shoulder, a silent gesture of support. Together, they formed a united front, and for the first time, Brandon felt isolated, exposed, and vulnerable. The balance of power had shifted, and it was clear that the outcome of this evening would never be the same again. The tension in the room was palpable. Brandon was still trying to hide his fear behind a forced smile, but every glance he received made him mentally recoil. Michael gave a discreet signal to one of the guests, and within seconds, a giant screen set up for the ceremony began displaying images. Brandon blinked in astonishment. Photos and videos of his past arrogant and petty behavior flashed across the screen, insults hurled at employees, instances of humiliating his associates, and even private scenes he thought were confidential. The guests murmured in shock, some stifling laughter. Elizabeth stepped forward, radiating confidence. "Brandon," she said calmly, but with a breathtaking authority. "Tonight, everyone sees who you really are. And I refuse to stay by your side if it's to be treated like this." Brandon stood up abruptly, red with anger and shame, but Michael didn't move an inch. He simply placed his hand on Elizabeth's shoulder, silent but powerful. The orchestra, at Michael's discreet signal, began to play a solemn melody. The captivated guests watched Brandon struggle with his own image projected on the screen. Each past humiliation struck him to the core, and he finally understood just how cruel and arrogant he had been. Elizabeth felt a wave of relief and empowerment wash over her. For the first time, she felt fully respected, supported, and free to speak. Brandon, on the other hand, was completely out of control. His arrogance had crumbled before the unexpected alliance between the bride and her protective brother. The evening, which was supposed to be her triumph, had become her public nightmare. And deep down, Elizabeth knew that this was only the beginning of a well-deserved revenge. Furious and humiliated, Brandon tried to speak again. It's not what you think," he stammered, his voice betraying his panic. "These videos, they've been taken out of context." But the entire room held its breath, and not a single guest seemed to believe his defense. Michael, implacable, took a step forward and fixed Brandon with an icy glare. "To believe you could still manipulate people's perceptions after everything that's been revealed, that's naive, Brandon. Very naive." Elizabeth, now confident and radiant, stepped forward in turn. "It's not up to you to decide my worth. I deserve respect, dignity, and tonight, I choose never to remain silent again." At these words, several guests applauded discreetly. The murmurs of support grew, and Brandon felt his dominance completely crumble. He realized that not only had he lost control of the evening, but he had also lost authority over Elizabeth herself. Michael made a subtle gesture toward the staff, and a series of documents appeared on a table near the screen. They detailed evidence of Brandon's manipulation and malfeasance in both his professional and personal life. The guests scanned them in disbelief, and Brandon felt his world crumble before everyone's eyes. Elizabeth took a deep breath, and her voice echoed through the room. "This marriage is not just about an engagement. It's about respect. And tonight, we are bringing the truth to light." Brandon tried to protest one last time, but his words fell on deaf ears. He had lost all support, all control, and all dignity. The revenge orchestrated by Michael and Elizabeth had firmly taken hold, and Brandon understood that there was no going back. For the first time, the bride felt truly free. And as the entire room watched Brandon fall, Elizabeth realized that her life had just taken a turn she could never have imagined. Brandon, humiliated but defiant, refused to accept defeat. His fists clenched, and a fierce rage blazed in his eyes. "You won't get me like this," he shouted, his voice echoing throughout the room. "This wedding. I'm still in control." Michael simply watched him calmly, without a gesture, as if he already knew that Brandon had no chance. Elizabeth, on the other hand, advanced slowly, each step affirming her confidence and determination. "Brandon," she said, her voice clear and authoritative, "you thought fear and arrogance could crush me. But you don't decide my life. Tonight, you're not in control." Brandon, gripped by panic, attempted a final, desperate move. He stepped towards the giant screen to turn off the projection, hoping to erase the evidence and regain some semblance of control. But Michael, quick and silent, intervened. With a precise movement, he stopped Brandon before he could touch anything. "You see, Brandon," Michael murmured, with terrifying calm, "the truth cannot be erased, and justice always prevails in the end." The guests, witnesses to the scene, held their breath. Brandon realized, too late, that he was completely out of his depth. Not even his arrogance could do anything against the alliance between Elizabeth and Michael, nor against the truth they had revealed. Elizabeth stepped forward again, her eyes shining with confidence and newfound strength. "This marriage was supposed to be the beginning of my life, not the end of my dignity. You've lost, Brandon. And it's time you accepted it." Brandon stepped back, defeated and ashamed, unable to utter a single reply. What he thought would be his triumph had turned into utter humiliation in front of all the guests, and for the first time, he realized he was not in control of the situation. The evening, which had begun with his dominance and arrogance, was now ending with his spectacular downfall. Elizabeth, on the other hand, radiated a newfound strength, ready to take control of her life and show that she needed no one to be respected. The tension in the room had reached its peak. Brandon, completely thrown off balance, wandered almost like a shadow, unable to respond to the accusing stares directed at him. Every whisper from the guests weighed heavily on his conscience, and he felt his position of power crumbling completely. Elizabeth stepped forward to the center of the room, straight, confident, and radiant. The light seemed to focus on her, as if the whole world recognized her newfound strength. "Tonight," she said firmly, "we have seen the truth. We have seen that arrogance and cruelty can never overcome respect and dignity." The guests applauded warmly, and some even stood up to show their support. Brandon looked down, unable to face the scene unfolding before him. Michael approached him, implacable. "Brandon, it's time for you to leave. You had your chance, and you blew it. This marriage will never be your triumph." Brandon attempted one last reply, but no words came out. His face betrayed shame and defeat. Even his legendary arrogance had vanished, replaced by utter powerlessness. Elizabeth took a step forward and raised her hand, not in a threatening gesture, but as a declaration: "Tonight, I choose my life. And this life will never include someone who belittles or disrespects me." The guests, witnesses to this transformation, applauded enthusiastically. Brandon, humiliated and defeated, left the room, while Elizabeth and Michael stood side by side, invincible and united. For the first time since the beginning of the day, Elizabeth felt a true breath of freedom and power. The humiliated bride was gone. In her place stood a strong, respected woman, ready to face the world with determination. The next day, news of Brandon's downfall spread rapidly through all social and professional circles in the city. Guests who had witnessed the scene recounted with admiration how Elizabeth had regained control of her life and humiliated her arrogant husband in front of everyone. Elizabeth, still wearing her wedding dress, sat in her room, looking at the photos and videos from the evening with a mixture of relief and pride. Michael entered, an approving smile on his face. "You were incredible, Elizabeth. Tonight, you showed everyone who you really are." She smiled, feeling a new strength growing within her. "I never want to be silenced by fear again. Tonight has shown me that I can defend myself, and that I can choose my own life." Meanwhile, Brandon was facing the consequences of his actions. His affairs were now under scrutiny, his former partners regarded him with suspicion, and his closest friends had begun to distance themselves. The arrogance that had defined his life for years had finally backfired, leaving him with a painful sense of isolation. In the hall where the reception had been held, the guests continued to discuss the evening. Many admired Elizabeth's courage and Michael's impeccable strategy. Some whispered that this alliance between the bride and her protector had forever changed the dynamics of relationships and respect within their social circle. Elizabeth stood up, ready to step out onto the terrace. The evening breeze caressed her face, and for the first time in a long time, she felt free and in control of her destiny. Brandon, despite all his attempts to control her, was now behind her, a figure from the past she would never again allow to define her. And as night fell, Elizabeth knew one thing: her life had just taken an irreversible turn, and she was no longer afraid of anyone. The weeks that followed were a mix of upheaval and revelations. Brandon, still unable to salvage his image, saw his reputation completely collapse. His former allies shunned him, his businesses were in jeopardy, and every attempt to rectify the situation ended in further failure. The fall had been total, public, and irreversible. Elizabeth, on the other hand, was thriving. With Michael by her side, she had not only regained her dignity, but she had also earned the respect and admiration of everyone who had witnessed her transformation. She received messages of support, congratulations, and admiration, and her self-confidence was now unshakable. The day she returned to the reception hall to collect her belongings and thank the guests, the scene seemed almost different. It was no longer a place of humiliation, but a symbol of her victory. Every smile, every respectful glance, testified that the bride had now taken control of her life. Michael, standing beside her, placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "You changed this evening, Elizabeth, and you changed your life. No one will ever be able to bring you down again." Elizabeth smiled confidently. "And this is just the beginning. I now choose freedom, dignity, and respect, for myself, and for everything I do in the future." Brandon, meanwhile, was now a shadow of his former self. His attempts to regain his honor were futile, and he understood that he could never overcome Elizabeth's quiet strength and Michael's unwavering support. The evening, which had begun with Brandon's dominance and arrogance, had transformed into Elizabeth's resounding triumph. For her, every smile, every admiring glance, was a reminder that true power lies in courage, dignity, and the ability to stand up for oneself. And as the sun rose on a new day, Elizabeth knew she could face the world, free and invincible, with the certainty that she would never again be a victim. The humiliated bride was gone. Only the strong, respected, and victorious woman remained.